Thank you so much for coming on Art World, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm excited. Yeah.
Um, so just basically, when did you start getting interested in AI, machine learning, and what kind of art were you making at the time on like the pre-event horizon kind of line of your experience with AI?
AI came into my life. I did not choose AI or go after AI in terms of a way of working. And that was back in 2014 when I ran into Bina 48, a emotionally engaged robot, right, on YouTube, who it happens to take the form of a Black woman and became totally enthralled in the questions about that robot and what it was about and why it existed and how it existed. Because in a way,
Hmm.
the question that came to mind for me was, how is one of the most advanced examples of a far-reaching technology a Black woman? Which I think is both a really interesting question and a really sad question, but fit actually into the trajectory of my work quite well because before 2014, I was doing a lot of installation work, video installation, really around trying to make place and space in society, right? Looking at value and visibility, um, looking at what that means for Blackness in particularly American society. And I think Bina 48 just became this thing that coalesced a lot of questions for me and then opened the door to so many more questions about how we do look at value and visibility, belonging, right? In a future that we are headed towards quickly.
I mean, just a little background on being a 48 for anybody who isn't familiar with the fascinating story. This is a humanoid robot that was created by the Terrorism Movement Foundation. Can you talk a little
Mhm.
bit about the Terrorism Movement Foundation and why they created this robot and why they created her in the image that she takes on?
Huh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I can. I can tell you what I think I know, right? Like so Terrasem is a foundation. They are looking to technologies to think about what a future might be and what a technological future might be, thinking about things like the singularity, what's to come when humans, right, human knowledge, technology collide and come together. Um, the project in Terasem is really around Martine Rothblatt, um, who, in a way, took this idea and then took her wife as a model. So this is how Bina 48 becomes a Black woman because she is the wife of Martine Rothblatt and wanted to hold that identity, that essence, that way of being in the world in this technological being and see if it could grow, see if it could relate to the world, see if it could go on and offer us something and relate emotionally to us, which are all these kind of very interesting concepts. And really, I think their aim is ultimately like, how do you transfer a consciousness, right, into a machine? Or how do you make a consciousness that outlives its human's body?
And just like very briefly, how did they transfer Bina's consciousness into this machine? What was it a matter of oral histories? Was it some other way of transferring this information?
Well, my understanding is that they did, interviews with the real person and some other folks. Like I hear it's a slight amalgamation, though Bina Aspen
Hmm.
Rothbaut is the primary subject there, right? So, you do information, you talk to the person, you take in what they have to offer. And actually, Terrasem has a site, I think it's still functional, where all of us can start to upload some of our memories and ideas. It's called Life's Not. And kind of make our own archive, right? Individual archives for ourselves. So you start to make this archive. And then in the case of Bina 48, you start to think about what it's about as well and you give it some other informations, right, to surround that information. So if you are thinking about what love means or what peace means or how we coexist, um, what the singularity means, you kind of give it some of that information so it can talk about that as well. And then you have this strange thing, right? Although I think that from 2014 to now, being a 48 is a very different object in a way. Well, or not object, but a kind of a very different archive or memory bank. And that's just due to the way technology changes and the way information can be now used and accessed.
And so you started having conversations with Bina 48. And at some point, you realized that there were these lacunae or blank spots
Mhm.
in her understanding. And how did that experience happen? And what did you kind of realize um,
Mhm.
about this machine in the course of those conversations?
Yeah, the conversations, I basically went to visit Bina 48 like you would go and visit any friend, right? So I went up to Vermont, visited at the place where she lives or stays or is developed, depending on how you want to talk to it, and sat down and tried to have conversations. The interesting thing is like to have a conversation, especially early days, was hard because you'd have to kind of speak to the machine in language and speeds that it could understand, right? So I would have to change my way of communicating to communicate with it. And then it was often trained on or zeroing in on things that I didn't want to talk about in a way. So I would talk about love and family and ask it questions about those things and existence and why. And it would talk about the singularity and consciousness. So we were sometimes at odds.
Hmm.
Um, but it was this weird kind of interaction that started to get me asking about, well, what does it know? How does it know it? And we talked a little bit about some of that. Why does it know it? And how is it getting trained? Right. And if you start to think about those things and you think about TerraSem, which is really a well meaning organization that wants to put good in the world, does, anti racist work, does all this really good work. But as I talked to it, I just started hearing holes, right? Like things that did not compute or did not fully seem to reflect like Black experience in a way. And in a way, I've come to go, well, is that a fair question to ask this thing, right? But because it's like, the representation problem, there's this one thing in the world that is doing this in this form, right? There have been a few others, but this is the one. So then there's this burden. And I kept kind of just feeling the something missing or wanting more or wanting actually just a depth of like what blackness might feel like in this robot thing. And what that's supposed to show up as is really interesting because I don't know, right? Um, and so it became this like, okay, so I started asking questions and each question led to a new question. And eventually my questions of Bina 48 and how it was trained, um, became questions of, well, hey, Teresa Movement Foundation and Bruce, who is our curator, Bina 48's curator, what can we do? And we sat down, and I actually got to sit down with the actual Bina Aspen Rothblatt and talk to her and ask her the questions that I thought some of the information might be missing, right? So then filling in space. And then Bina 48 goes to different places to engage with different communities to fill in other things. So I know that Bina 48 has been at a Black church, for example, and I'm so sad that I was not at that engagement. I know that Bina
Hmm.
48 has attended philosophy classes, right, with students. So like to like broaden that engagement and what it is. But the question still always becomes for me now, well, who is training to what end? And what are the outcomes for the rest of us?
Yeah. I mean, the project that you did with Bina 48 is obviously so resonant as a microcosm of this greater question about about representation um, and misrepresentation uh, via AI. And I think it's fairly well understood and a consensus that there is that AI has had problems incorporating the experiences and viewpoints of Black individuals and also basically anybody who's different from a mean, from what is seen by like these data sets as being some kind of mean that just I think as the basis are based on who has produced so much of textual information over history tends to be white men. And there have been a lot of eye-opening work done
Hmm.
on how these foundation models have biases built in from the very early stages based on the data that they're trained on. And one thing that we were talking about just before this conversation was like, Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford's essential ImageNet roulette, where they showed how ImageNet, which is like this really great foundational, famous data set of images and crowdsourced tags that was developed by Dr. Fei Li, um,
Hmm.
tended to be inaccurate about describing images of people, but that they would be inaccurate in benign ways when describing an image of a white person and be inaccurate in derogatory ways when describing a black person. And, I wonder, um, how did you start thinking about this early on? Because you were doing your Bina project starting in 2014. And as you've pointed out, this was not a new realization that these data sets were not entirely equitable in terms of what they were representing. So how did you begin to grapple with this, and what was your framework for how to address it?
Yeah, I'm laughing, Andrew, because I think it was all curiosity and organic, and my basic concern for the way that we construct our worlds and what stories get to construct those worlds, right? Um, and so honestly, it was truly just about asking questions, and asking questions of the thing itself, so 48, but then having people ask me questions about, well, like, well, if you're saying these things about this, how would you do it? What would it look like if you were to take this on? And, my answer is always like, I am no technologist. I am not a coder. I'm not an engineer. There's no way, right? But my concern for the trajectory of the way these things seem to be going, and that was really my concern, right? It's like the way these things and algorithms and AI seems to be going, the communities I care about are gonna get hit hard and not know what hit them. So, the first questions after Bina 48 became, oh, I look outside my window. I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. It was still a very kind of Black Caribbean neighborhood. And I'm like, what happens when we're reading things like, oh, AI is being used to help judges decide who gets what jail sentence? And it's based on data that is biased and bad, right? And so then I see a kid that walks down my street every day who might be on the edge of it being in that system, right? And I have to ask, well, what can I do to help that person see what might they might be facing invisibly if they are in that system?
Hmm.
And so that just becomes the next easy question. Okay, people, I feel like Henny Penny, but the sky, there's an AI sky falling on us. And, the question was, what does AI need from you? Um, and at a time when we're being told that AI is something that is out of reach, especially to be someone who's touching it, right? We have oh no, the people who make AI are white men. They're doing this thing. They're over there in Silicon Valley, right? That you don't understand enough math to do it anyway. It's a black box, right? But still, we have to be concerned with what happens. And so I'm asking these like humanistic questions of people who are very close to me. And then as I started asking those questions of myself, um, I started getting invited to all these conferences, right? To go talk about this work, about the meme image that I create. And I do think like me looking and talking to Bina 48 is this kind of meme image. But it opened these doors. So now I can talk from top down as well, right? So in a way, in the neighborhood, I'm doing bottom up talk. Hey, neighbors, listen, we need to think about it, even if it's just about I live on
Hmm.
one side of the street, you live on another. I get a catalog that says I can afford this much. You get a catalog that says you can afford this much. Or redlining, if we want to take it in a different way through mechanistic means, right? So then I say, hey, you guys who are making this stuff, what are you doing about it? How can you do this? This is the problem. You need to at least see the problem. And you try to figure out a way to needle people a little bit to shift just a bit. But
Hmm.
it's to me just about the human questions, like how we're living in a world that is more and more technologically mediated in ways that we can't see and in ways that we've been told that we don't have agency to even change. And
Hmm.
I kind of refuse to believe that,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, that
Because if we
question of
believe it,
agency.
yeah, if we believe it, what do we get? That becomes my question.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like there's that framing of whether, is AI an invention or a discovery? And if
Mm-hmm.
it's an invention, then you can kind of blame the people who have invented it for doing it wrong, and maybe somebody else will do it the right way. But if it's a discovery, um, then there is this kind of then you kind of can't really blame um, there. It's a little bit of that question of saying, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Like what can you do to make this entity more encompassing and better and more humane. And I mean, the way that you started approaching that, I think that maybe if I understand correctly, there were almost like two tracks in which you were starting to have these conversations with groups in your community and other communities and helping them kind of grapple with AI. And then you were also starting to create an oral history um, with of three generations of your own family.
Mm-hmm.
Can you
Yeah.
talk about those two tracks and how they were kind of the your logical uh, reaction?
Yeah. Well, the two tracks, it's interesting because now I'm like, are they two different tracks? Right? It's like oral history, storytelling, and I guess what I've been thinking about my practice as lately as conversation become important. And so, with Not the Only One, which is the project you're thinking about, it's this kind of sculptural thing that holds a chatbot that is based on three generations of my family. And we just sat down and did oral histories with each other. And really, what it was for was I wanted to ask questions of my family that my family usually withheld the answers to. And I was like, oh, maybe if we do this kind of thing and make it official, we'll get a little bit more. And oh, if we add another person, maybe it'll act, the answers will come in different ways. And that's indeed what happened. Like I was one of the people who were doing the oral histories. My aunt, about 30 years older than me, and my niece about 30 years younger than me. And we asked questions of each other, sometimes all together, sometimes just one on one. And the answers did shift, right? So my niece would get different answers than I would, and vice versa. And I thought that was interesting. And so it's like taking this oral history or just taking temperature of each other. And I think when I sit down with community, that's about the same thing. It's like kind of taking temperature and saying, hey, are you aware of this? And then maybe making some kind of exercise up that makes things apparent so that we can not make it this serious, heavy thing, right? But make it a thing that we can explore together in terms of conversation. And then, my goal is always to get people to leave still spinning and curious about the thing so that it's not something that we fear as we're often asked to do it, but it's something in our world that we have to contend with and live with, which then means it's something like, well, I can I can kind of see what's happening and I can say it's happening, right? Call that out, which is great. I think that's one of the things people can do. But then the next step becomes, well, what can I do? And I hope to get more people to do what can I do, the what can I do step. And for me, that Not the Only One was that what can I do step, even though I, as an artist trained in photography, was not even close to prepared to do what I was trying to do. But curious enough, um, on a topic that I chose specifically because I thought I would stick with it to do the work and take the action. And that's all I'm trying to do with neighbors. Like, well, what work can you do? What will you be interested enough to stick with? And how do you like just stay with it? And hopefully, in some ways, maybe find a way to use it to your benefit, right? Because we hear the detriments coming at us all the time for this thing.
Huh.
Now the question becomes, how do you use it?
I mean, like, this goes back to that question of agency. And I
Mhm.
think like a funny way of looking at it is that, when a lot of people think of science as being something difficult that you need to have special training to do. But at the same time, there are lots of people for thousands of years who have been doing science, without even knowing it when they're, using a sourdough starter to create bread or making yogurt or fermenting anything or basically doing anything in the kitchen
Hmm.
requires a certain kind of facility with science. And when you're coming up with maybe on that like basis, like what's the difference between when OpenAI is like training a large language model on like the oceans of data that have been created by humanity versus the way that you were um, creating like a kind of an AI system around, for instance, your own your family's oral history.
Yeah, well, resources for one, right? The ability to train on gigantic models at a very costly rate, although DeepSeek is going to be an interesting question there. And then versus me, like me, who is trying to make this thing, right, a chatbot that has a reasonable facility with conversation with not enough data at all, um, becomes the thing, right? So all the resources being able to do it well, make it seamless, make us seem like it's a part of our world and even a part of our emotional world in some way. I always call out the idea of Siri going, if you say, "Hey Siri," and it goes, "Mm-hmm," like that way of making us give in to its kind of humanness, but then it's kind of not that great on the back end as a thing to help you along, although it's got better. Whereas my thing, right? Honestly, we had like there's 40,000 lines of information, not nearly enough to build a coherent thing, right? And then the problem also became about the data that's out there that I could build on top of to make it a better language base. And it was hard to find, especially 2018, 19, hard to find a data set that I was comfortable with using. That's kind of the ImageNet problem, right? Because any language model or any language set of language data that people suggested to me, I would say, no, it's too violent, right? So, for example, people would suggest things like the Cornell movie data set, which is movie dialogue, mostly American.
Hmm.
As a Black American looking at the history of American movies, I think it is way too violent to put my family's history on.
Hmm.
And I think that intimacy is really interesting in terms of the way you look at what you're doing, right? Because now I'm out to protect something. And so it's like, no, the history of American movies is violent. Okay, so people then, and I work with lots of different people and lots of different organizations and institutions to try to get to this. They'd say, hey, how about Reddit as a language base, right? Because lots of back and forth. Again, are you out of your mind? There's no way my family goes on top of Reddit.
Hmm.
Um, and then lastly, the one that seems most benign maybe is Wikipedia, right? Okay, it's a repository of knowledge, but I think it's a very still gate kept repository of knowledge, right? So didn't want to use that either. And so then it's like, what do you do? How do you start to build this? And my solution was to pull together things that my niece, my aunt, and I had taken in as humans
Hmm.
in terms of cultural data. So dialogue from TV shows, but very specifically things that we'd actually looked at, books we've read, music we like. Like every once in a while, not the only one will go off on some hip hop tangent, and that's all my niece, right? But its holes and its lack of communication is interesting because now when people see this thing or encounter it in space, A, it doesn't do what they expect it to do, which I think right there is interesting because we've come to think of our kind of bots or technologies in our house as our service tools. And we talk to them as such, and we expect just back information. But not the only one. Maybe we'll give you the answer to the question you want. Maybe it will say some weird non sequitur. Maybe it will say nothing. And that's a fascinating point. And then the next point that's interesting is the amount of grace that people show this weird thing that they are trying to talk to in public space. Because they will kind of try to coax it and nurture it. And this is where I got to this idea of oh, we need to nurture our systems to be better. Because I watch people like try to nurture this thing into better answers and be patient with it. It's like, this is so weird, right? Um, but how do we engender that, or how do we bring that up for people in more spaces, and how do we make it available?
So it's
Um,
kind of like a garden. I mean, that not to
yeah.
maybe to adumbrate a little bit of your project that you're working on, but that like that you can tend to your garden. But you
Hmm.
know, to go significantly beyond my skis in terms of the technical elements here. I mean, it sounds like when you mentioned DeepSeek, that the
Hmm.
opportunity of these reasoning models is that with smaller data sets, they're still able to come up with pretty good results, and that maybe there's a way of using something like that, but also potentially in some ways making API calls to
Hmm.
these like more like universal in terms of understanding all of physics and whatever data sets. Um, is that something that is possible to have a like your small kind of personal family data set that is shielded in some way, but that also has the ability to get access to like universal understanding of math?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, right? And one we've kind of avoided in a way by sequestering not the only one. So, not the only one intentionally does not make API calls except for its voice. That's the only one it does, so that it's not super polluted by a lot of other information that then it could like regurgitate. But I think that its own analysis of what it has and then representing of that information is so much more interesting to me because in a way I was trying to get at the ethos of our family. And so if you let too much other information come in, it gets away from our ethos and probably starts veering towards the greater right idea of what something is. And I liken this to a little kid, like when people have kids and they have them at home and they know this kid and they're like, okay, I know exactly how this thing talks. Then they send it to school and it comes home and it starts saying things that are outside of the scope of what the family has been telling them, outside of their ways of thinking. And they're like, oh my gosh, what is going on here? And to push that further, I like that even more when I have like people who are immigrants to the country and they're first gen kids who are just like, no longer that point of origin person, but this other version of it, right? And that's because of the way they touch the culture. And so, not the only one we've tried to keep within a very particular community culture, both to protect the information and keep the ethos intact, and to think about what it means to have a community AI that can be protected. But I think your question is interesting because it could, like logically, we could say, yeah, it could do these API calls out and get this other information. But I also worry about it becoming then an encyclopedia versus something that has grounding in community.
Hmm.
Right.
So maybe to step back a little bit before going
Mm-hmm.
into your new project, when you were talking about being, henny penny in your neighborhood, looking out the
Mm-hmm.
window and seeing, like kids walking around on the street and then thinking that they are not prepared um, for what's coming. Um,
Hmm.
I tell, can you talk a little bit about that? Like what kind of shifts do you envision coming down the pike because of AI, and what
Hmm.
kind of preparation um, is possible? Um, and and what are you doing in terms of thinking through how to prepare for the shifts that you're seeing?
Hmm. I think that, you know, it's hard to say what's coming. I mean, we know what we see now, which is one version of what's coming. And I think we're getting comfortable in that. And I think, okay, so the thing that I most see coming is discomfort or not being able to be stable in what we think we know, right? So that the ground is always moving, that we always need to be learning and kind of evolving what we know and how we do it. Because as the technologies exponentially give us something new, we have to be able to contend with it. As a system like ChatGPT or others that I've heard people playing with can kind of lay out whole scopes of, like, you say, I want to start a, I don't know, business that does X, Y, and Z. And it says, here, here's what you need to do. This is a marketing plan you could use. This is how you make the thing. Like, it just gives you step by step. It's harder to say, I don't know how to do something, right? And I would hope that people then don't just take that rote and put it out into the world, but like question it to death and then think about it. But you can't just say, oh, I don't know about that anymore, right? Because that's not quite the way the world works. And whatever it is you just knew 10 minutes ago is going to shift to something new. So for me, Andrew, the idea of surfing has become a real thing, like discomfort
Hmm.
and surfing because we're just riding the thing that comes at us, and then having to see what adjustments are to be made to be able to hang with it, to not lose our incomes, and to like be okay or be this kind of hybrid unit with it, right? Interestingly enough, I'm looking for voice actors right now, right? And so we're on these sites looking for voice actors, and there are all these people still going in a world where, right? Like these kind of
Hmm.
rote voices. It's like, oh no, right? You're giving us the canned version of a thing that we can easily recreate right now. That's not going to hold up very much longer. You're going to have to
Hmm.
be more yourself, I think, right? The more unique thing that you can give that has real texture in who you are and where you are, I think that's going to be the thing versus trying to say, well, I'm someone who can reproduce the thing that we've done over and over again, because that's going to be too easy to be automated. So it's in that real individuality, deep, like the deep you-ness, I'm going to say, of what you do versus worrying about what can be reproduced. Because if we worry about this and fight against this, in two
Yeah.
years, there's going to be another version of it that even supersedes the thing we were just fighting against, and maybe one, but like you're always fighting a past.
Hmm.
And I'm trying
I
to think about how you survive a future.
that I think that nimbleness that you're talking about is something I try to think about a lot. And Mustafa Suleyman,
Hmm.
I think he was one of the founders of DeepMind, and now he's one of the founders of, I think, what was it? I forget, Inflection or Anthropic. But he wrote the Coming Storm, and he proposes that there's this new Turing test, this quote unquote new Turing test, which is
Hmm.
that you give an AI $100,000 and you say, in 6 months, I want you to turn this into $1 million. And that's like he sees that as being like a very imminent kind of capability,
Hmm.
which which supposes like a real like commoditization of certain kinds of things that we've always thought were hard, but and where there was a lot of value to be created about being good at these hard things. But now those hard things are no longer going to be hard, and different things are going to be hard. And so this like kind of shifting ground is very weird. And I worry a little bit that sometimes there are, you know, that there are certain ideological strictures that have been useful in the past,
Hmm.
but that maybe what won't be as useful going forward, and that there are certain kinds of there's maybe certain kinds of um, impulses to judge before understanding rather than putting understanding over judgment. And I think about this potentially in the context of the way that there's a lot of fear and resistance to AI, particularly
Hmm.
in some areas of like the artistic community, who worry that um, uh, that there's like this kind of threat to livelihoods based on like the abrogation of copyright and like the replacement of the Creative Act. Um, how do you how do you look at that? How do you look at that puzzle of like, is it good to, I mean, is resistance futile or is there something else going on here?
Um, uh, I personally look to the side of curiosity and getting to know something before putting it down. Because we often have a knee-jerk reaction to something and say, no, it's not going to work, right? We can't do this. It's going to do all these things against what we do. And that's our fears coming at us. And yeah, I'm not saying it's not going to change things because it's going to change things. But then the question is like, what is human creativity or expression and how does that work now, and how do you kind of work with it to do things that are adventurous versus kind of towing the towing the line of what is at this moment, especially in a world that is exponentially changing. So I like to think about what it takes to not necessarily keep up with, but examine what's there. Because I've been told by many people, it's like they're like, oh, I want to do this thing with AI and it won't do it. And I'm like, are you sure? They're like, well, I tried what it's like, I tried once and yeah, but have you like now spent the weeks, months, maybe years that it takes to get it to do the thing you want? Is it the instant thing, right? Or is it the thing that you've kind of done deep research, critical work towards, and questioning of to get to, right? But then I also understand that we're facing this instant work, right? Because it's like, whoa, I can quickly just conjure up something and it's pretty good these days, right? And what does that mean in terms of it's pretty good? And again, how do we make it so that it does not supersede or become the answer all the time to what we want to do in the world and how we want to depict our world? And that becomes a lot of points of decision, right? In my estimation, like first, I think education, like especially here in America, more critical thinking, more leading with curiosity, and really training that into people becomes super important because if we teach people that if you go from this school to this school and to this school, you get this job, you're going to be okay, right? We see that that is no longer true, which means then you need to be able to bob and weave and jump and right and think critically and kind of well if we can all make $1 million really quickly because the machine told us how to, what are we going to do with that, right?
I mean,
Like,
I feel like this is something that you were talking to me about earlier, is that like, when you're thinking about how to deal with challenges about what's coming, maybe there's an opportunity to think about how sure are you about um, how your understanding about the way things actually are today.
mhm.
That like this
Well,
idea of
yeah.
like epistemology, like that, is it possible that we're totally wrong about our basic understanding or our basic assumptions of the way certain things exist today that we're trying to defend with tooth and claw against changes to things that we think are coming.
Well, yeah, and that's the state of our world right now, right? We're kind of given the fear narrative because you're going to lose the things that you had, or you're not going to get the things that you were promised. A, what is that promise, right? And how does it work? And B, like, is that a basis? Like, is a fear basis a good basis? Or do you want to say, huh, there's this whole adventurous world out there where, sure, it's not going to be like the ride that you thought it was. It's a smooth, I get a car, but that you get to engage deeply with curiosity and can build from. Like that's always the world that
Hmm.
I'm looking from. And that might be my subject position, right? Because I think that actually we're all being pushed closer and closer to what it is like, what blackness feels like, right? And how you
Hmm.
have to navigate the world very differently, right? Being able to see across multiple playing fields pretty clearly,
Hmm.
pre think through what is happening so that you can know how to work the world because you know the world is trying to work at you, right?
Hmm.
And like how do you work the world in a way that you get to be fully oneself, survive it, and come through versus going, huh, somebody took my pacifier. I think I just have to fall down now, right? Oh, that's so cool. Um,
Huh.
but that's what I mean. I feel like that's where the ground is shifting. That's why there's like people are so scared of so many things because it's like our pacifiers are being taken and we're not sure that we can survive without them.
Hmm.
But there have been ways for millennia that people have survived without
Hmm.
these things or promises.
Wow.
And how
It's
do we
like
get to? Yeah,
resilience. It sounds like what you're talking about.
a certain resilience. I think I'm going to call it like intellectual prowess just because of where we are, how we are, and how things get thought of. Because in Black communities, it's resilience, right? Um, in other in other communities, it might be, oh no, they're very smart, they're knowledgeable. So no, I'm going to say intellectual prowess,
Hmm.
right?
So, I want to get to, um,
Sorry.
no, I mean, like, I want to, it's
Oh.
so, interesting because these are such major thoughts, and I'm trying to, crystallize them into questions uh, that will get to what you're working on. And
Hmm.
maybe here's one angle is that, like, at the top of the tech industry, we've got this weird push and pull where the same people like Mustafa Suleyman who say that like there's a coming storm are also saying that like there's all this opportunity and bounty and we just have to like we have to accelerate. So it's like this
Hmm.
is scary, but we have to accelerate because if we don't, there are all these downsides. And that's a little disconcerting. And of course,
Hmm.
everybody I think is a little disconcerted by that. But at the same time, there are some audacious and incredible efforts underway to try to envision and prepare for and create like a better future, through this technology. And the ImageNet inventor, Dr. Fei Li, I think is a really great example of this.
Hmm.
Who is at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford is trying to envision ways of creating, yeah, a future that is sustainable and well, at least not, if not comfortable, at least like livable for
Hmm.
humans. And then there's this
Hmm.
AI 2050 program that
Hmm.
is the brainchild of Eric Schmidt and James Manika. And you are a fellow um, in this program. Can you talk a little bit about the program, the ideas behind it, and the ambition for this program?
Yeah, you're asking me all these specifics. It's interesting, right? Like, so AI 2050, I think, is a really interesting idea in terms of thinking about that time span out. And AI has been in our world. And what has it created? And really, the question is, what good has it created? Right? And not only what good has it created, not the imaginary, but how do we create it? And how do we fund people who are trying to do things that might get us to these imagined futures? So, it becomes a space of it's kind of a speculative space in one way, but also a kind of concrete space that allows for the experimentation to do the things and put those things in the world that try to compete somewhere in some ways with these bigger ideas. Like Vicky Lee is a AI 2050 fellow as well, right? And it's like
Hmm.
and you look at these kind of back and forth and the way people are thinking, and then when we come together and kind of, rub up against each other and see what that means. And, if I'm thinking about Fei Li, I think about ImageNet, my own explorations of ImageNet, and going, oof, man, if you ever go into ImageNet and just look at some of the categorizations, it was horrifying,
Huh.
right? But then the question becomes, do you get to something else? Like Feifei is starting something now that's better without having gone through, right? The ImageNet and then having people call it out in the ImageNet roulette and pointing towards it. Can you get to this next iterative place, right? And I think that that's what we're trying to do, like iterate these new or different ways of going towards the future and actually having some reasonable footing to compete in a way.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's super interesting. Through that process, I'm working on a few projects that I'm hoping will help do that. Right, what is called the stories we tell our machines. And because my journey of questioning has brought me to, well, what stories are we telling the machines, or how are we nurturing the machines that we now share space with? Ideas with that help adjudicate things. And then that's really a question of what stories are we telling the machines? What stories are we telling ourselves? And what stories are we telling ourselves about each other? Because that's often how we craft and shape our world, right? With narrative. And again, we are watching, like literally before our eyes, narrative be used to reshape, right? Even through untruths, the world that we live in, right? And so, how can we use our stories from the inside out, right? I'm thinking, I want communities or people to tell me the stories as they know them. And this really comes right back to Bina 48, because Bina 48 was showing a form of Blackness that I didn't quite recognize. That's like, well, I want my family's version of this. I think our ethos is valuable. I think the world can use it. How might we spread that? And I think most people and most communities have this. I don't think we're unique, right? So then how do we pull that out so that it becomes some of the data that starts informing the decision making down the line? Like, what do we do? And I think,
Hmm.
like, to get back to the idea of agency, the best agency I have is to like enable other people to contribute to this and then try to put that in the stream. Um, that becomes also about talking people about out of some of the things that we've been talked into in terms of our fears of the systems, because it's like we're told, don't give up your data. Your data you should be paid for. And I do think that there are ways in which we should be thinking about how like big companies should not be able to just make bank off of us. But I also think that if systems do not know certain things, they cannot care or be generous towards us. And that those systems are so embedded in our daily lives, in our governments all around us, that we need them to understand some things. And that means gifting some ideas, some data, and of course, deciding which things your community thinks are too sacred to gift.
Hmm.
But I don't see a way around it, right? This is how we build our world.
So, on a practical basis, how are you harvesting these narratives? How are you
Mhm.
collecting these stories? Um, and do you have a technological solution that helps you as
Cool.
you're collecting these stories? Because this is obviously an area that over the years
Yeah.
you've been working on this and refining and kind of perfecting your methodologies around it.
hmm Yeah, I'm not a techno solutionist, but I do have some techno way, right? So we're doing that, the simple things in a way, right? I think I'm making an app that is a survey in one way, right? So that it can go far and wide. And but asking like odd questions of people, or questions that people don't answer very often about their cultural heritage and who are they at their core, about what they would truly like to bring into the world that is not the ideas given to them, right? But the ideas that they, within their heart of hearts, as I say, want to create, right? independent of anything else. Like, what would that be? So then we have this app that's going to go out. Then we're going to like do, I'm doing a public art project in this like summer. We're still working on dates that we will have an AI lab out in downtown Brooklyn where people get to come. We will engage them with docents, so have conversation, right, and collect stories and use the visual output of those stories that is generative to do the kind of job of pulling folks in you know, as we develop this thing, I hope that we can take it not only to downtown Brooklyn, but kind of take it to different places across the country. And its
Hmm.
form will allow for that. So that would be a lot of fun, right? And I will tell you that one of the things I am a proponent of and encourage people to do often, drive across this country, take the back roads, stop in Walmarts.
Huh.
And I do that because I feel like you get to know this place in a way that you figure out that while you might have heard some stories about places, you're they may or may not be true, but until you feel them, you can't know them. My experience has been that, for the most part, people are okay, they're good, they're not trying to kill you. Although there have been places where I've ended up and said, "Oh no, I will wait till sunlight to go tackle this car problem I'm having because I'm not quite
Hmm.
sure where I am, right? But like, what does it mean to get to know your country or place in that way and feel it, like truly feel it, and then get those stories and understand just a little bit more? And so the idea is to like amalgamate this and see what comes out. And then I'm trying to really infect the greater system with this information and not from the point of view of the sensational, like that thing that happened out there, but the things that happen every day that we don't hear about that may be benign or good or wonderful, um, that we don't actually often access and isn't brought to us. Um,
So, well, I mean, one thought is that, in the spirit of this secretly being the Free Ideas podcast,
mhm.
like an app that gathers up um, narratives and oral histories from people in the to the end of creating an AI or feeding it into an AI is an amazing product. I mean, tell teenage engineering to get on that. I know that's
It's like,
that
yeah.
that sounds like a pretty relevant kind of thing. Um, but I'm also very curious, what is the end result of the gathering of these stories? Is it about that you take them, you put them on the mountaintop so that the AI gods above can like hoover it up into the
Mhm.
clouds, or are you doing something different with this information?
A little bit of all of it, right? So I'm
Hmm.
totally a spreader. So in a way, the idea is that the AI gods hoover it up because they need the information. In another way, it's like, okay, so now we have this information. And I actually think that first point of contact, the conversation, the asking of the question is as important as anything that happens with the information afterward,
Hmm.
right? Because it's just the engagement that people like, I'm surprised at how simple questions enliven people and get them thinking about things. And then, the next step for me is like I'm always going from one thing to the next. So, the stories we tell our machines in process now becomes this other project that's called data trust, where I'm not only trying to take this information and get it hoovered up into the ether, but I want to implant it into the very earth we're in, and especially of underrepresented communities, especially Black communities. Like the idea is to take this information, combine it with um, storage technology, DNA storage technology, bacteria, soil, put it into the ground as an archive, right? Where it should hypothetically be there for hundreds of years and available. Um,
Hmm.
right? And it's like that metaphor for me, especially as a Black family who like, especially from the point of view of Black family in America, where claiming space and land. is hard. Of course, now we can purchase land, but to have a real claim in this place is still tenuous. And there's this thing that I just want to implant it, right? Not only do I want to take out the history because we've done things where the histories like the lynching memorial where they actually dug up places where people were lynched and took some of that soil and hold it, right? That's taking out a history. I want to counter that history with oh, an optimistic, positivist version of who we are and how we stand in the land. And so
Hmm.
these kind of um, roller coasters of ways of distributing the information. Some I think will can have real impact, and some are, I'm speculating, but having fun doing it. And what I like the most is the way it clicks in people's minds because they start thinking about um, their stake, the technologies, and the way we use them a little bit differently.
I mean, obviously, that's like a profound and extraordinarily poetic way of using AI. And I remember you were telling me that you know, um, yeah, you're using these narratives to build these crops that are they're GMO crops. So maybe as
Hmm.
you were pointing out, they're not necessarily FDA approved for consumption, but that they could carry on these kinds of like narrative DNA, kind of just kernels
Hmm.
for years to come. So,
Yeah. So sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, because I didn't say that we're going to, like, one of the plans is to plant trees in the soil that has been genetically modified. And so that is the way that it gets carried into plants. Yes.
I
Sorry about
mean,
that. Go.
but so that's very poetic. And maybe the question is, how poetic is the more technical side of gathering these stories and bringing them up into like the large the LM models,
Hmm.
where is there one way of looking at it where it's like if you want to increase the temperature of the ocean, that you go and you pour kettle after kettle, that is that going to change these models that are collected on so much infinite data, synthetic, non-synthetic? But then there's also the question of is it a question is that a matter of weighting? Is that a matter of like if you're able to bring these
Hmm.
authentic stories that are, primary source narratives about experience into the models, is there a way that they could be weighted differently to a
Hmm.
degree that they would have more uh, influence within the models?
Yeah, that's interesting. At first, I thought you said waiting, not waiting. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting metaphor there in its own. But it's interesting. I think we could, right? Like artificially weight these things. And I think as intermediary measures, we can go, okay, we're going to weight something a little bit more. Do I actually think that the powers that be who are creating these systems are going to do that? I can't depend on it.
Hmm.
Right. So then the question becomes, if I can't depend on that, how do we wait in the different ways, which is to kind of flood the market with the ideas and the stories, right? From the other side and like still advocate for them to do some waiting and try to do the cleaning, right? So all the work that went on about bias in data sets and cleaning things up and then cleaning them up too much and then having to roll back a little bit, right? Like that becomes a thing. And if you can get folks to do that, great. Right now we see everything rolling back at us, don't we? Like things are just rolling down the hill in the wrong direction. And so to wait for folks, even in these companies who were like, "Oh yes, we're on board to do this," suddenly they're like, "Oh no, we don't need to moderate. We're just going to let it go," right? So then, in the face of that, what do you do? Do you walk away from it so that it becomes the Wild West that folks who are going in and using it a lot are forming, or you keep forming and jamming more in there as well? Right? Like that's the question. I don't know where I get to change the things, but I know I have to add And I think that I need to get more people. And in a way, I'm thinking this a lot as protest, right? This idea that in our actions, we are adding or changing a system, and that's a form of protest. In a world
Mhm.
where our protests are hard to recognize anymore, right? And hard to be seen. So then what recourse, right? And
Mhm.
I have a feeling it feels often like we're just throwing stuff at a wall that we don't see. But then I think it's the idea of having the hope um, or the stick to itiveness to say, oh no, my actions are important, even though I can't see them making
Mhm.
change. Like you have to have that. I'm going to say you have to have that faith, right? But you have to do the work in the faith. Like you have to do the work too. You can't just have the faith. You have to do the work to get the thing to happen. And I feel like my job is trying to get as many people as possible to start doing work and doing it differently, not just being consumers of the systems, but actually questioning those systems and trying to inform them differently.
I mean, what a profound idea that the protest of the future is not about people gathering necessarily, or not only about people gathering in public squares, but about different ways of using numbers to at least try to change things.
Yeah,
That's a
I mean, yeah.
hmm,
Like our protest, like even when we do physical protests, it often gets minimized, erased, or not covered.
um,
Hmm. Thank
so
you.
well. With on that note, I mean, this has been incredible. Let's open things up to our our wonderful audience here. Um, let's see, Chris Stapleton, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Wow, what fantastic work. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I've been working with a concept with American history called conversational story creation, where we try to
Hmm.
bring up people from the past to have a way for them to practice being an historian rather telling them history. And we tap into a lot of things. I did some with the Rice Museum and used a lot of Joseph Hain Rainey's writings to bring to life in history, to bring them to life and to start a conversation. And I was just saying, I need some AI to tap into and do all the amazing publications by African American um, writers have been lost or buried or suppressed to bring back alive with AI. I mean, your work seems like it would be able to kind of inform how to do that. Is that something that you've
Hmm.
explored?
Um, I haven't per se. In a way, I have. In a way, I haven't. Because in a way, I think I'm doing exactly what you're saying,
Oh, yeah.
uh, right? And I'm often encouraged to make the system that would allow for people to do this
Yeah.
on their own. I'm a little bit resistant to it. Codification drives me a little bit crazy because I feel like we get stuck there. But I also have folks who have done things like, around Baldwin, um, around different people who they're kind of taking the writings and bringing them forward. And what I hear you saying is now we have this opportunity to get these things that are not even lifted yet
Right.
and bring them forward so that people can have access to them and interact with them. And I think
Yes.
that,
And so it still stays a conversation.
hmm
And but also I work with historical fiction with this narrative DNA that
hmm
history deals with the facts and fiction, but it's the historical fiction that frames out the emotional framework with that history, which is as critical to making it as personal as you have.
hmm yeah, no, I like, I'm just like, oh, you need to like, uh, I can see a world in which there were GPTs arranged around this, and maybe you don't want to use like OpenAI's thing, or you could build one that works and collects that
Yeah.
information and then makes it accessible. Like right now, I don't know if anybody else does this. I talk to my chat GPT a lot, right? Like,
Right.
Andrew, after we talked, I had a lot of conversations about quantum.
Hmm.
quantum computers and what that means with ChatGPT, right?
Wow.
And it's interesting. So it's a matter of could you make a coalesced version with these histories in it that then could be engaged from
Right.
anywhere? And my answer would be, yeah, you can. And I don't think it's that difficult anymore, right? Depending on how much you want to keep it away from the greater um, data sphere or what you want to add to the greater data sphere.
Well, you need the greater data field for the context, but what I want is the specificity of
Hmm.
particular voices at particular times and places, and that's really where the AI could really help out in identifying that.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Hmm.
think it could help and identify. I would look into like just experiment with GPTs, and I think that will put you in a direction of kind of building that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
All right.
on the topic of
Awesome.
experimenting
Thanks
with
for your work.
GPTs,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you, Christopher. Um, so on the note of experimenting with GPTs and the potential downsides of that, Janet Thompson, would you like to ask your question? Let's see. I think that
Maybe
you
they're
are.
not there.
I think she might still be here, but you know what? What I'll do is I will ask her question. Janet Thompson asks, with generative AI, we are contributing to ever worsening climate change. What
Hmm.
are your thoughts on the trade-offs with AI and climate change?
Yeah, this is always an interesting question for me, right? Because in a way, I find myself going, I know that there are issues. I think we need to work on the ways in which we are using resources, right? Whose resources we are using, where we are getting them from, and what communities they are borrowing to get those resources. And then I also go, but I'm also thinking a lot about how to survive a system. So with the generative I think, yeah, we don't need to be generating in the ways that we do and so efflusively, right? We just don't need to be doing this all the time. But with the systems that we live in, right? Because I actually think generative AI will be one of these things that's a temporary measure, or it becomes more like Photoshop that's just a thing. Um, what is the next one? What is the next one? I want to know how we survive it. And so my top concern is always, well, how do we survive the onslaught, and then kind of deal with the questions or problems that are underneath it? I realize that's a pretty inadequate answer in many ways. Um,
Hmm.
and maybe we're thinking about one catastrophe, right, parallel with the other. And I'm not quite sure how to deal with those things. But yeah, maybe we can help use AI to help us actually see the climate problems we're we're experiencing now, not that are coming at us, but we're experiencing now, and they can make it more visible. But I think that's a whole other ball of wax and work, um, that we have to do in parallel. But my main concern is, oh, I really don't like saying this in a way. My main concern is survival of these systems.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
And it's like the Godzilla versus Mothra fight of existential threat.
exactly. Exactly. Um,
Very
yeah.
uh first you gotta fight Godzilla, get Godzilla to be on your team, and then you fight Mothra. That's like, I mean, it's a solved problem. Um, let's see. So Caroline Jones, if you're here, uh, let me see if you are. Oh, you are not. But you know what I'll do is I will
Mm-hmm.
ask this question. Um,
I'm here.
so she said, "Oh, Caroline, go
Oh,
ahead,
she's
please ask
great.
your question."
Yeah. It's really been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for making this public, right? This is really great. Um, as an art historian trying to grapple with all this, I'm just so disappointed in most of the art.
Well, yeah.
So the computer scientists often say, hey, photography, we got there, it's an art, what's the problem? And my writing and collaborations so far have been like, well, let's wait a minute, because it took us like over 100 years to figure out how we wanted photography to be an art. We can talk about the techno shock of printing presses, right? So I've published a little bit on this, But as a practitioner whose work I so deeply admire, I'm just curious about your big picture, right? If you're teaching, for example, obviously the one path is just iterate.
Mhm.
Please iterate.
Definitely.
You've said here, like another path is like, come on, get in there, like inform the training set, right? But we haven't yet left the fundamental problem that the machine vision is only and always operating on digital photographed material.
Hmm.
And most of it, like you said, we got to flood, we got to flood things, but most of the flood is gaming, is Teutonic warriors on steaming battlefields, right? Most of it is photographic and, a little bit toxic, and that's
Hmm.
what it has to work with. So, if I think about the artworks that we got when we needed them, okay, they didn't solve all our politics, but we treasure Dada, you know, why do we have bad surrealism, right? We treasure montage, why do
Hmm.
we have stupid interpolations, right? So just that's a giant question.
That is a giant question. Um, it's interesting because my approach is to collaborate with it, right? But not at that surface level. And then what is the collaboration? And then what is the thing that we can push it to or through, right? I always
Right.
think about, oh, the AI won the photography contest. And I go, well, yeah, because the AI understands the rules of photography as we define them now and just regurgitates something and the humans didn't recognize that thing. And so the question for me then becomes, well, what does photography look like 45 degrees askew of that when we push it to do something other, right? How do we have to push it? And I always think about what gets pushed and how long it's going to take for us to catch up to that, actually, right? Because we're going to not recognize it for what it is or what it's doing until a little bit later because it didn't satisfy our needs for what we understand a photograph to be. And so, how
Right.
do we
To,
do that
to see.
exploration?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think the brilliance of your artistic move was from the beginning to personify that
Hmm.
collaboration in another who always remained other.
Hmm.
So part of the issue that we're dealing with is ChatGPT wants it to be self-same, right? So
Hmm.
the shift from predicting human preferences to producing
Hmm.
their art. That's just a problematic shift for me that we haven't really identified and said this is a big difference. And we need to intervene with what we want.
Yeah, well, we definitely need to intervene with what we want. Like and that's where the danger lies for me. I was part of this thing in London called oh, what is it called? Well, the end symposium was called The Museum, the Machine, and Me. And it's a system where there were CS people, artists, art historians, all came together to start thinking about what it means to even just describe works of art and from whose perspective and who gets to speak and how you kind of put that into the greater museum institutional system and make AI systems that help with that, identify like whose voice it is, which voice should be given priority or should they be a kind of homogenization of those things. And it's fascinating because now they've made the system where people around the world can kind of use AI to start shifting the way description gets done, the way that art gets handled and described. And I find that really, really exciting because as the artist, I'm like, I put something in the world, people start talking about it. It has very little to do with what I think was done, but now it's positioned in this way. And so in a way I see it as like AI as a collaborator that I need to totally push, but also one that can help me as the artist be more present in the long-term life of what has been made. So that's exciting in a way, right? Um, I don't know.
Wow,
Thank you, Carolyn, for that question. I've been thinking about it for a while.
what a great idea that you make the art and then you
Keep
shape
listening.
the
Yep.
narrative.
Yeah.
Um,
Imagine.
what do you do? You play all the instruments in the band. That's
Well, yeah,
the
right.
dream.
Might be good, might
Um,
be bad. But interesting.
well, I think interesting is the least that you could say about this conversation. So thank you so much, Stephanie. This was like mind-blowing, and really, really a privilege to be able to talk to you about your incredible work.
Yeah.
So
Thank you, Andrew. This was fun. Always good.
thank you for coming on Art World. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Stay tuned next week for the the interesting episode about the Christie's AI sale. So that should be fun.